in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 800 kilometers southeast of Newfoundland. At 41.4 degrees north and 49.5 west, the darkness of the night between April 14 and April 15, 1912 still lingers. To this day, anxiety and fear mold the waves into constant distress. From time to time, passing ships can also hear the following on a scarce radio frequency. But after all, that is perhaps not that strange. 12,500 feet below, on the barren Atlantic seabed, lies the RMS Titanic. Early on the morning of the voyage, Wednesday the 10th of April 1912, the port of Southampton, where the RMS Titanic is anchored, is full of expectant travelers and curious onlookers, a healthy mix of nationalities and social classes. But whatever their reason for traveling on the brand new, state-of-the-art transatlantic steamer, they all have one thing in common: they have spent significant amounts of money on their tickets. Traveling on the Titanic is far from free. First-class passengers have paid up to $45,000 in today's money for a ticket. And even if the $6,000 that a third-class ticket costs can be considered small in comparison, the poor emigrants have sold everything they own to get the money required. The air almost vibrates of excitement and tense anticipation. Even though the boat is called unsinkable in the newspapers, many are making the journey across the Atlantic for the first time, and they are therefore rather apprehensive about squeezing themselves into a tin canister on the vast ocean between Europe and America. Although the third-class passengers, Selma and Carl Asplund, are not traveling over the Atlantic for the first time. They have migrated once before, but then moved back home to Sweden when Carl's father had died, and they have had to go home to deal with the estate. However, their eldest son, Philip, had not liked his new home country and through persistent nagging persuaded his parents to reconsider their decision and move back to America. When the family of 7 are finally led up on the gangway to the lower deck, the ship doctor greets them by examining their eyes to make sure no one brings the dreaded eye disease trachoma. After this, they are ordered to roll up their sleeves and show their vaccination scars, which they should have obtained the day before. If the scar is not clear enough, they have to be revaccinated, something they really hope to avoid, as the procedure often leads to soreness and swelling. For Selma and Carl and their 5 children, Philip, Clarence, Lillian, Colvin, and Felix, the procedure goes smoothly and they can start looking for their cabin, which is supposed to be located somewhere in the stern. At 12:15 it is time for the ship to leave on its long-awaited maiden voyage. Edward Smith, a white-bearded 62-year-old captain who has been in the service of the White Star Line for 30 years, is the man given the honorable task of bringing the ship across the ocean. With the help of 6 tugboats, the ship leaves the dock. But before it manages to clear the harbor area, a serious accident nearly occurs. Due to the strong currents produced by the Titanic's huge propellers, the ship New York breaks loose from her lines and heads straight towards the Titanic. Unfortunately, the incident results in nothing more than a delay to pick up the passengers in the French town of Cherbourg and in the port of Queenstown on Ireland. The cabin the Asplund family will be housed in has thick white numbers painted on the door. As it slides up on its freshly greased hinges, everything inside smells of fresh paint, and it's strange that they henceforth will associate this particular scent with untimely death. The smaller children immediately lay down on the beds, their legs tired from hours of waiting in line. Selma sits on the edge of the bed and wipes beads of sweat from her forehead while the oldest climbs into the top bunk. The father, Carl, announces that he is going for a walk, but quickly returns, complaining that the cabin is so close to the lounge. He fears that they will not be able to sleep if the party continues as it has already started. On the ship bridge, the daily ice warnings are starting to arrive. It has been an unusually mild winter in the polar region and a large number of icebergs have drifted down into the North Atlantic. As a result, Captain Smith chooses a more southerly course than the normal one. After leaving Queenstown, the ship follows the coast of the Green Island of Ireland for about 10 miles before letting Titanic stretch her legs across the open sea. The course set steady towards the so-called corner, a point southeast of Newfoundland that all ships heading west aims for before they, upon arrival at the corner, change course towards their destination. As the Titanic leaves Ireland far behind, the overcast sky clears and the headwinds experienced along the coast become a favorable tailwind. The temperature is still relatively mild, but a cold front soon sets in, and on the second day of the voyage the waves measure up to 2.5 meters. For many this is more than they can bear. A considerable number of people spend the evening bent over buckets and toilets. Otherwise, life on board is relatively carefree. In first and second class, days are spent with all kinds of leisure activities such as tennis and football, and in the evenings they eat sumptuous buffets and drink expensive wine. For third-class passengers there is less to do, although seasickness and hangovers keep a significant proportion busy. For the God-fearing, including the Asplund family, the church service is the highlight of the day, a fixed point to relate to for many long hours. Of course, there are also the meals, but these in themselves are nothing to look forward to. Porridge for breakfast, soup for dinner, and gruel for supper is not too appealing to the appetite. However, the meals are good opportunities to meet others who speak the same language. Out of 2207 passengers, 123 are Swedes, making them the largest national group other than the Brits. A larger group of Swedes is the Skoog family from Västergötland. They are 7 in number: parents Anna and Wilhelm, aged just over 40, with children Carl, Mabel, Harold, and 2-year-old Margit. Most strikingly, Carl is on crutches as a result of a previous accident in which his leg was amputated. There is also Sandal Niklasen, 29 years old, from Orust, who has more or less been forced to follow his siblings' example and emigrate. It is said that at the end of March 1912, Sandal walked around in his home village and said his sad goodbye. His brother Hjalmar, who remains in Sweden, is ill, and with his small farm and a few cows, he needs the extra financial support that Sandal will be able to send over from America. But at least he is not traveling alone. His friends Oscar Olsson and Carl Johansson have joined him, and together they befriended a larger group with 10 Swedish migrants led by the linguistically gifted Edvin Lundström. This Edvin from Skåne had migrated as early as 1900 to Fresno, and he had subsequently worked in China as a missionary and learned Chinese. Shortly before the Boxer Rebellion, he had returned to Sweden, but now he is on his way back to the United States with his fiancée Elena Olsson. The group also includes Agnes Sandstrom, 24 years, who is traveling with her young daughters from her parents' home to join her husband in San Francisco. In an interview at the age of 94, she recounted her experiences in the third class.
The cabins were made up every day and the meals were beautifully laid out. There was a lot of music and dancing. Those of us with children mostly watched, but we were like one big family,
Agnes said. She also got to know an older woman who was always knitting intensely on a cardigan to give to her husband who had already migrated. But later she had refused to jump into a lifeboat and the husband never received the cardigan. On the morning of April 14th, the telegraph operators received further ice warnings, this time from the ship Carolina. But these are not uncommon at this time of year, and if they have to watch out for icebergs all the time, they will never get to their destination. Apart from the fact that the ship is called the Titanic and is said to be unsinkable, it is also believed that ice can be detected in good time. On Sunday, the weather is initially overcast and cold. In the afternoon, the temperature drops further and it becomes very cold and foggy. At 7:30, the SS California sends a message about a wide ice field, located only half a mile to the south of the Titanic. At 9:20, Captain Smith, who's been attending a dinner in first class, arrives on the bridge and orders the lookout to keep an extra eye out for icebergs. Despite knowing that the fog can make it difficult to spot an iceberg in time, the high speed of 20 knots is maintained. Earlier in the day, the ship's architect and passenger, Bruce Ismail, is reported to have made the suggestion to the captain to increase the speed further, although Ismail later denied this. Towards midnight, it becomes increasingly quiet on board the ship. The whole of Sunday has had something of a midday feel to it. When the initial excitement has subsided and neither alcohol nor music can ignite any fervor in more than the worst drunks, the worst partying has stopped. Most of the passengers go to bed early or are about to do so, but in the telegraph room, however, there is feverish activity where the first telegrapher, Jack Phillips, is fully occupied in his work to settle the extensive telegram traffic via the American coastal radio station Cape Race, which grows as they get closer to their destination. Earlier in the day, they have also had to interrupt transmissions to repair a broken transformer, and in the meantime traffic has been piling up. At 11:05, a new message is received from the ship California. The telegraphist on the California sends a report that reads, "We have been forced to stop and are now surrounded by ice." Phillips, who is busy with his duties, replies brusquely, "Shut up, stop, I have contact with the Cape Rays," and then he turns off his station. There are those who claim to be able to smell ice. On board the Titanic, there are a number of passengers who will later claim that they were able to do just that. Whether the lookout boys, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, had this ability remains untold. They are very cold and only have their eyes to help them because both of their binoculars disappeared before leaving Southampton. At 12:22, Flea sees something black straight ahead and strikes the warning bell 3 times and then calls the bridge. The 6th mate, James Paul Moody, answers, "What do you see?" "Iceberg straight ahead." First mate, Murdoch, immediately gives the order to go full port and full speed astern in all of the ship's engine. Although the collision with the iceberg is relatively minor, the Titanic quickly begins to take in water. Up to 300 tons of ice-cold water are pouring in every minute. According to calculations, the ship should be able to float with 4 watertight sections filled. But the collision has resulted in 5 sections being torn open, causing the bow to drop in water to flow over the bulkhead. The water flows first into Boiler Room 6, then Boiler Room 5. The room is soon also underwater, as are several cargo holds. Just seconds after the collision, the ship's captain, Edward Smith, arrives again on the bridge and is informed of the incident. Mr. Thomas Andrews, one of the Titanic's onboard designers, is called in to determine the severity of the damage. After some quick mathematical calculations, Andrews announces that the Titanic will sink within 1 to 2 hours. Selma Asplund wakes up in the collision. Soon after, someone knocks on their door and shouts that they should put on their life belts. Shortly afterwards, however, they are informed that there is no danger and that they can go back to bed safely. Her husband Carl still thinks it's best to wake the children, and while Selma gets them out of bed and dresses them as quickly as possible, Carl starts looking for the life belts. The hallway outside is getting crowded and worried voices are starting to be heard. Carl can only find 4 belts because it's a 4-bed cabin. Many years later, Selma said,
"We had to borrow a belt from one of the crew members, so we had 5 in total. So my husband and I and the 3 oldest children each wore one as we started to walk up the stairs to the deck. Me with Felix on my arm and Lillian in my hand while my husband led the 3 boys."
Along the way, they knock on the door of an elderly lady from Stockholm they have spoken to earlier. But she doesn't answer. Perhaps she has listened to the rumors that they are going to be revaccinated. Smith orders to prepare the lifeboats, which he knows will not be enough for everyone. At the same time, orders are given to the telegraphers to send the first distress signal. At 12:15, they receive a note with the ship's position and they send the first distress message. CQD, have collided with an iceberg. Sinking fast. Come and help us. Soon they start mixing SOS and CQD but only receive replies from ships saying they are too far away. All around the ship, more and more people realize that things are going to hell. Like a poison slowly spreading through a body, shutting down more and more of the vital organs. Water has started to leak in several places on some of the third-class decks, and these passengers are now trying to move upwards to find out what has happened. Meanwhile, the crew is trying to do everything possible to calm the passengers. A full-scale panic will not help the already difficult situation. For example, the orchestra with band leader Wallace Hartley is ordered to play calm music. At 12:20, the first lifeboat is prepared for use. At this time, the outdoor deck is dominated by first-class passengers, as many of the third-class passengers are still being denied access. With all the talk of the ship's infallibility, the apparent calm and the orchestra playing, First Mate Murdoch and a few others find it difficult to convince the passengers to get into the lifeboats. Around the same time, panic breaks out in the lower decks. Many are more or less trapped by various obstacles. Gates, complicated long passages with many stairs and long corridors. Those who do manage to make it to the top are mostly rejected from taking a place in a lifeboat because the rich with women and children are given priority. 25 minutes later, the first lifeboat, number 7, with room for 65 people, is lowered, but with only 8 people on board. As time goes by, people realize that the boats really need to be filled. However, there are those who refuse to take their place. Some first-class men, realizing that their lives will only be saved at someone else's expense, report to various smoking rooms where they remain, seemingly unconcerned. After that, Smith has let the crew know that they have done a solid job. He declares that it henceforth is a case of every man for himself. The captain then walks to the center of the bridge, from where he will follow his ship to the bottom. Out on the walking deck, the gravity of the situation is now palpable.
So far, my husband and I and all 5 children had stood close together, ready to die with each other. But suddenly Lillian was snatched from me and thrown into a boat. In the next moment, Felix was also grabbed from my arms and thrown into the same boat.
Selma Asplund told. At 1:15, the first distress rockets in all the colors of the rainbow are sent up into the sky. Then the panic on the walking deck breaks out with increasing force. Almost at the same time, the ship begins to list heavily and families and groups are split up. Many members of the third class panic and try to gain access to the lifeboats, and the ship's officers are forced to draw their weapons, which reduces the panic and the loading of women and children can continue. In desperation, some men disguise themselves as women to avoid being denied a place on the lifeboats.
I don't know whether it was my husband who took the boy from me and gave him to the officer or whether he threw him into the boat himself. I turned to him. Why did you do that? Why couldn't we be together at the end? But he didn't answer. He just pushed me towards the boat and wanted me to get inside it.
No, Selma didn't want to leave her husband. She asked him to come with her, but he explained that he could not. The children were already in the lifeboat crying, and someone shouted that they should bring the children's mother down and put her in the boat as well. And before she knew it, she had been pulled down. The next moment, a man fell partly on her and his shoe kicked her hard in the face. And as if that wasn't enough, his hand was immediately placed over her mouth so that she wouldn't attract attention to the stowaway. When she looked up at the deck from where she came, she saw Carl take the 3 remaining boys and leave to try to find a place in another boat. This was the last time she saw them. At 5 minutes past 2, the last lifeboat is lowered into the sea and more than 15 people are still left on the sinking ship. Many of them start to move further and further aft as the front of the ship is underwater. At 17 minutes past 2, the Titanic sends out its last distress signal. 1 minute later, all the electric lights go out. The horror of complete darkness and the icy sea that washes over the deck, taking many people with it, causes many to jump in of their own volition. Just minutes later, a loud bang is heard when the ship breaks in half between the 3rd and 4th smokestack. Most of the passengers on the aft deck now fall into the water and die. Many who are already in the sea are crushed to death by the large pieces that detaches from the ship. When the front of the ship has disappeared below the surface, the stern still stands straight for a few minutes before the last of the Titanic finally disappears below the surface at 20 minutes past 2. The ship now leaves behind a large number of people still alive in the cold ocean. While many are fighting in vain for their lives in the freezing water, the lifeboats are only a few hundred meters away. Of these, only lifeboat number 14 returned to the scene of the accident to try to rescue as many people as possible from the water. However, due to the coldness of the water, most people have already died before they arrive. As for the other Swedes reported of earlier, the following is said: after the collision with the iceberg, Mr. Lundstrom helped get people from the group he had been leading into lifeboats, including Agnes Sandstrom and her daughters. He said that their lifeboat had capsized and that he himself had jumped into the water and that he later had been rescued in another lifeboat. However, this is highly questionable. None of the lifeboats actually capsized, and of the very few people actually rescued from the water and almost all the crew members, it was probably the case that he simply could not say that he succeeded getting on a lifeboat while his fiancée failed to do so and perished. The Skog family was never seen by any survivors on the walk, perhaps because their son Carl was on crutches and they could not get up quickly enough. As for the reluctant immigrant Sandel, he did not survive either. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes from the collision with the iceberg to the complete disappearance of the ship. However, the actual time of the whole process does not tell us too much. It was probably, for some, a lifetime between the knocking on the cabin doors and the death in the cold sea, and for others it was just a short moment. Some people's minds go into overdrive while others become numb as disaster strikes. For some, the survival instinct kicks in full force, and this may explain some of the unflattering behaviors exhibited by many. Some choose no means to survive while others lock themselves in their cabins or stay in smoking rooms and talk. Another Swede named Morris Adal, a former immigrant who traveled from his wife and 2 children to earn money for his family as a carpenter in Brooklyn, had written a final letter home to his wife on the 9th of April.
I am still in Southampton. All the America Line boats are stopped because of the coal strike, so we were transferred to the White Star Line again. We will leave here tomorrow afternoon with the Titanic. It is a new boat making the first trip across the Atlantic and is the largest the White Star Line has. I hope all goes well and that I can soon come home to my darlings, my everything on this earth.
The 24th of April, Morris was found frozen to death in his lifeboat. After examining his clothes and identifying what was considered valuable, the body was lowered into the sea according to the rules for the Titanic's third-class passengers. On the body, a block chain with a horseshoe and a pocket watch were found that had stopped at 34 minutes past 2, 14 minutes after the sinking of the Titanic. The valuables were sent home to his wife Emily, who put them in a cardboard box with the letters. When the grandchildren asked to see Grandpa's box, Emily would sit in the next room. Moritz Adal's clock stopped for good at 02:34. Maybe it was then that the wall that will always separate us from the horror that happened that night was erected. And perhaps it is fortunate that the night of April 14th and 15 is not a place we can visit, or can we? Anyone who finds themselves in the middle of the Atlantic on a cold spring night might think otherwise. But perhaps it is not only in retrospect that we can experience things. Maybe some events are so powerful that they can be sensed far beyond the place where they take place. That was what the little girl Jessie, who lay dying in her bed in the town of Kirkcudbright in Scotland, is said to have done on that night of April. W. Rex Soden was a captain in the Salvation Army in the town. On the evening of April 14, 1912, Soden had already gone to bed when someone knocked on the door and asked, "Captain, can you come right away? Jessie is dying." Soden immediately dressed and went to the room where the little orphan girl lay. He sat alone with her for a few minutes, but at exactly 11 p.m. she sat up straight in bed. When she saw Soden sitting next to her, she said, "Hold my hand, I am so afraid. Can't you see the big ship sinking in the sea?" Soden, thinking the child was dizzy, tried to reassure her that it was just a nightmare. But Jessie was not reassured. "No," she replied. "Someone named Wally is playing the violin and he is coming towards you." Soden looked around the room but saw nothing remarkable. He gently laid the girl back down on the bed and then she fell into a coma. Captain Soden sat with the dying child for several hours without observing any change in her difficult condition. But then he suddenly heard the door handle to the bedroom being pushed down. He got up and went to open it, but no one was there. However, he had a strong feeling that someone had walked past him and into the room. Returning to the bed, he realized that something had happened and that death was now only seconds away. Then the little girl opened her eyes and said, "Take me to heaven." Soden held her hand for a little while and then she died peacefully. He got up from the bed to get help when he heard the door handle being pushed down again. And again there was no one on the other side of the door. But he couldn't help thinking that Jessie's mother had come and taken her away. A few hours later, news of the sinking of the Titanic began to reach the world. Among those drowned was Wally Hartley, the bandmaster that Soden had known since he was a little boy. He had had no idea that Wally had been on the RMS Titanic.